Perseus. When the wicked king Danaus persuaded his daughters to kill their husbands on their wedding night, there was one, Hypernestra, who refused to slay her lover, and by saving him brought upon the head of cruel Danaus the doom that he had striven to escape. The grandson of Hypernestra and Lynceus was Acrisius, king of Argo, a kindly ruler who dearly loved his daughter Danae, and kept her always near him to delight his eyes with her great beauty. Unfortunately, the king chanced to learn from an oracle that he would one day be killed by his grandson, and hoping to prevent this, he shut Danae in a high brazen tower, which no one was allowed to enter on the pain of death. He placed around the tower a strong guard, so that no one could even get a glimpse of the imprisoned princess. But though no mortal wooer could approach her, Danae's loveliness was not hidden from the eyes of Jupiter, and as he looked down from high Olympus and pitied the maiden's loneliness, he loved her for her great beauty. Fearing to frighten her if he assumed any mortal disguise, and not daring to appear before her in his divine splendor, he took the form of a golden rain, which fell softly on the sill of the tower and window, and charmed the lonely captive with its brightness. Each day, this strange visitor came to glorify her darkened room, and Danae looked forward eagerly to its appearance. Thus, by the means of the golden rains, Jupiter won the maiden's confidence and love, and spent many hours with her in her high tower room. Danae was not lonely any more, but people who passed beneath her window could hear her singing to herself all day long. One morning, the astonished attendants rushed to King Acrisius and told him that in the brazen tower was a mother and child. His daughter Danae had given birth to a son who was so beautiful that they called him Perseus. The king was enraged and threatened to put the boy to death. But as he was unwilling to stain his hands with the blood of his grandson, even though his grandson might cause his own death, he put Danae and her infant in a cask and set them adrift in the sea. For days the strange boat tossed about on the ever-rocking waves, and the poor frightened mother prayed to the gods to save her and her hapless child. Jupiter heard her cries, and no storms came to bet the frail boat upon the rocks, nor did any rough seas imperil the voyager's safety. At last, the cask was washed gently up on the shores of the island of Seriphus, where a friendly fisherman rescued Danae and her child, and took them to the king, Polydectes. This ruler received them kindly, and allowed them to live at his court. And here the young Perseus grew up into manhood, learning all the games and sports that belong to the training of a Grecian youth. Meanwhile, Polydectes had become so enamored of Danae that he wished to marry her, and grew very angry at her continued refusals. His wrath was increased when Perseus forbade him to distress Danae any longer with his unwelcome intentions. As Polydectes did not dare to kill Perseus or banish him from the kingdom, for he knew that his suit would then be hopeless, he began to taunt the youth with his inexperience, and asked him why he did not set out on some adventure to prove his mettle like all the other heroes. But Perseus did not consider himself a hero, but he did hope some day to do great things, and the sneers of the king began to work on his proud heart, as the wily old monarch had expected and hoped. The youth then demanded to have his courage and endurance put to the test, and Polydectes promptly told him to go and slay the Gorgon Medusa and bring the head back as proof of his valor. Perseus needed no urging to set out at once, though he knew well the danger of the undertaking. His mother implored him to remain with her, but the youth was determined not to endure Polydectes' taunts any longer, and he was eager to prove his bravery even at the risk of his life. There were 3 of the Gorgons, all of them hideous to behold, but Medusa was by far the most terrible, for besides her frightful appearance, she had the power to turn those who looked at her into stone. She was once a beautiful maiden who had the misfortune to offend Minerva, and that goddess, to punish her, changed her into a dragon-like creature with long tusks, a scaly hide, brazen claws, and instead of a hair, writhing masses of snakes were there instead. To this monster, Polydectes sent the young Perseus to fight, feeling sure that he would never return. The young hero had not journeyed far before he noticed that someone was walking beside him, and turning to look more closely at the stranger, he was at once surprised and frightened at recognizing that it was Mercury himself. But the messenger of the gods bade him have no fear, for he himself had come to help in the perilous quest for the Gorgon's head. And then Mercury lent Perseus his own winged sandals, and told the youth that he would have to do some swift moving in the course of his adventure. The god also lent him a magic helmet that rendered the wearer invisible, and bade him offer thanks to Pluto as the sender of this invaluable gift. But not to be outdone by the other gods in kindness, Minerva lent Perseus her shield, the terrible Aegis of Jupiter, which the warrior goddess carried with her into battle. Thus, equipped for the combat, Perseus had no fear of encountering the dreaded Medusa of the snaky locks, and pressed forward eagerly on his journey. He had already inquired of Mercury the way to Gorgon's cave, but the god could not direct him, and told him that he must find the Graciae and learn the way from them. The Graciae were 3 hideous old women, who had been grey-haired even from their birth and received their name, and they lived in a far-off land where eternal darkness reigned. They had only 1 tooth and 1 huge eye among them, and passed these around to each other in turn. As they alone could tell him where Medusa dwelt, Perseus started northward on Mercury's winged sandals, and after flying for many days in search of the 3 sisters, he came to their cheerless land. He found the old grey women seated under the drooping willow tree that fell so far over them that it almost hid their shrunken forms. As Perseus approached the spot where the grey old women sat crooning to themselves, he took good care to keep on his magic helmet, and he watched closely to see when the eye was being transferred from one old head to the other. Just as the elder sister was taking out the great eye, and the one who was next in turn was holding out her shriveled hand to receive it, Perseus stepped quickly between them and snatched it away. The old woman began to grope for it in her pitiable blindness, and then arose a fierce dispute among the sisters as to who really had the eye, To end the quarrelling, Perseus gently spoke to them, telling them that he had taken their treasured eye and would return it to them as soon as they had informed him where to find Medusa of the snaky locks. For a while, the grey old women pretended that they had neither heard of Medusa, but finding that the unseen speaker was determined to keep their precious eye until he had received the desired information, eventually they told him the way to the cave. Perseus then returned to them the huge eye, which seemed to stare at him with a very knowing look, and sped off on his winged sandals to the country where Medusa dwelt. As he flew along the sea-coast, he saw in the distance a dark cavern among the rocks, and in front of it, on the glaring white sand, lay a monster which, even from his great height above the water, Perseus could not glance at without shuddering. Remembering Minerva's caution, when she gave him her shield, he used its bright surface as a mirror in which were reflected all the objects below. And never once was he tempted to turn his eyes towards the dreadful figure on the beach. Its scaly hide glistened in the sunlight, brazen claws shining like live coals, and the snakes that lay coiled around its head shot out their tongues and hissed whenever the Gorgon stirred in its sleep. As Perseus drew nearer, he saw, reflected in his polished shield, the forms of men and animals that had been turned to stone by one glance of Medusa. These were very numerous around the mouth of the cave, and Perseus silently prayed to the gods that his figure might not be added to their number. Some distance away lay the other two Gorgons, Medusa's sisters, but the young hero had no thought for them. His whole attention was centered on the blow that he must deal the sleeping Medusa before the snakes hissed so loudly that she would be awakened. Even in his shield, the sight of that twisting, wriggling mass of reptiles was so repulsive that Perseus shuddered and was tempted to run away. But just then he heard a whisper, "Be quick, strike swift and sure." And as he recognized the voice of Mercury, all his courage returned. Grasping his sword more firmly, and holding its bright shield above the sleeping monster, he swooped down upon it, and with one swift stroke he cut off the head with all of its coils of serpents. It was only a moment's work to sheath his sword and grasp the hideous trophy in his hands. But even then the danger was not over, for the snakes on Medusa's head began to hiss so loudly that their noise awoke the other two sleeping Gorgons, and they looked around to find why their sister had disturbed their rest. Seeing Medusa's headless body on the sand, they set up such terrible cries that the noise re-echoed like thunder through the cavern. And as far away as Perseus had flown, he could hear the awful sounds that made the seashore seem like some vision in a dreadful nightmare. As he hurried over the sea with Medusa's head firmly in his hands, some of the blood dripped down into the white-caped waves and was cherished by Neptune, who had once loved Medusa when she was a beautiful maiden. From these drops of blood, the Sea King created the wonderful winged horse Pegasus, who was to share in the adventures of another famous hero, Bellerophon. Some of Gorgon's blood had also dropped on the hot African sand as Perseus was flying upward from Gorgon's cave, and from this sprang a brood of poisonous reptiles that ever afterwards infested the region and brought death to many an unwary explorer. journey homeward was long and wearisome, and Perseus was often obliged to seek the seashore to rest. Once, as he was flying along the coast of Africa, borne aloft on the winged sandals, he saw old Atlas standing where he had stood for many centuries with the weight of the heavens on his bent shoulders. The clouds wrapped his head so completely that Perseus could see only his immense body. Forests had grown up so high around him that his huge legs were scarcely visible from among the heavy foliage, and his broad shoulders looked like mighty boulders rising up from above the treetops. But though his head was so far in the clouds, Atlas knew that Perseus was approaching, for giants have certain senses unpossessed by mortal men, and he shook the clouds from about his face and blew away the mists with his breath. Then, when the air was clear, and Perseus could see the white hair that was previously hidden above the clouds, he pitied poor Atlas for his heavy punishment, and stopped to speak with him. The giant looked down from his great height, and begged the hero to uncover Medusa's head, which Perseus had kept wrapped in his cloak, for he was anxious to gaze upon it and become himself an image of stone. He told how weary he was of standing for all the ages without ever being able to rest, and he could not endure the thought of keeping up this torture for eternity. And so Perseus lifted up the Gorgon's head, being careful to keep his own averted, and Atlas gazed long and eagerly at the dead face with its wreath of lifeless serpents. And then slowly the giant's great bulk began to harden, and the stooping shoulders became firm, unfeeling stone. As Perseus stood there watching the strange transformation, he seemed to see no longer the floating white hair of Atlas, but a pile of snow on a mountain top, and he looked no more on the huge limbs surrounded by forests, but he saw rents and the clefts on a mountainside that just showed themselves through the thick trees. Thus was the burden of Atlas forever removed from his aching shoulders, and the heavens now rested securely on a mountain. When Perseus resumed his journey along the coast, he soon came to a place where the cliffs rose abruptly from the sea, and as he looked down at the rocks below him, he saw, outlined against their dark surface, a figure that made him pause his swift flight, and wonder if a sudden madness had taken hold of his fancy. For chained to the rock was a maiden so beautiful that even her constant weeping had not marred the perfect loveliness of her face. Keeping the Gorgon's head carefully concealed under his cloak, so that the captive maiden could get no glimpse of the snakes, Perseus flew to the girl's side, and taking off his magic helmet, spoke to her gently. At any other time, she would have been startled at this sudden appearance of a stranger, but the thought of her dreadful fate so near at hand drove all other fears from her mind. The spray from the sea dashed over her, and the cold winds blew on her shivering form. But of this she seemed to be hardly aware. Her eyes were fixed in wild terror upon a cavern in the rocks, where Perseus could see a huge dragon lying stretched out on the cool, slimy seaweed. When the young hero spoke to the maiden, she did not seem to hear him, but at his gentle persistence, she at last turned her eyes away from the dreaded cavern and told him her story. She said that her name was Andromeda, and that her mother, Cassiopeia, had angered the sea nymphs by presuming to rival them in beauty. To punish the queen for her vanity, the nymphs sent a fierce sea monster to devastate the homes along the coast, and when the terrified people consulted an oracle to know how they might save themselves from further disaster, they were told that the monster would not depart until the princess Andromeda was sacrificed to its fury. So the king, her father, and her wretched, remorseful mother, and a procession of weeping attendants had led her that very day to the rocks and chained her fast to await the monster's pleasure. Just as Andromeda was speaking, there was a rustling sound in the cave, as if the dragon were stretching its huge wings. And then came a sudden whir and rush, and the monster glided out of the dim interior of the cave and came speeding through the water towards its victim. The scaly hide glittered in the sunlight, and the great coils of its snake-like body beat up the waves as it came with incredible swiftness toward the captive maiden, whose terrified shrieks almost unnerved the young hero who had come to rescue her. Quickly, he donned his magic helmet and grasped the keen-edged sword that had already stood him in good stead. As the monster's head emerged from the waves, Perseus rushed upon it unseen, and with a quick thrust, pierced the creature in its one vital spot. The dragon sank back into the blood-stained water, and then made a few ineffective plunges towards its victim. But the blow of Perseus had been sure, and the creature's great body finally disappeared beneath the waves. While Andromeda was thanking her savior with grateful tears, he struck off the chains that bound her to the rock, and led her to where her parents and an astonished group of watchers had been looking on at the strange combat. The great joy of Andromeda's father was equalled only by the mother's happiness over her rescued child, and they both welcomed the young hero who had saved her from so terrible a fate. When Perseus had been entertained royally for 7 days, the king bade him demand any reward he wished for all his heroic service, and the youth boldly asked Andromeda's hand in marriage. To this the parents gladly consented, although she was already betrothed to her uncle Phineus, and the preparations were begun at once for the wedding. While the marriage celebrations were in progress, the jilted suitor, who had been too timid to attempt any rescue of Andromeda, now came forward to claim his wife. His pretensions were laughed at, however, and he left the court angry, plotting revenge. The following day, he appeared with a band of followers, and he suddenly attacked Perseus, who barely had time to defend himself. The friends of the young hero rallied to his support, but they were outnumbered by the attacking party, and a disastrous battle might have ensued had not Perseus bethought himself of a sure means of defense. Catching up the cloak in which he had wrapped the Gorgon's head, he cried, "Whoever is my friend, let him turn away his eyes." The courtiers of King Cepheus and the men fighting around Perseus obeyed him, but Phineus, the jilted suitor, and his followers believed this to be a mere trick to gain time, and looked on while Perseus unveiled Medusa's frightful face. Some of the gazers had their spears in uplifted hands. Some were fitting arrows to their bows as they turned their eyes a moment towards Perseus, but in whatever position they stood, just so they were suddenly turned into stone. By some chance, Phineus had been watching his men instead of looking at the Gorgon's head, and when he saw their dreadful transformation, he fell on his knees before Perseus, and with outstretched hands he implored the hero to spare his life. But Perseus forced him to look upon the dreadful face of Medusa, and, like that, he became a stone image with averted head and supplicating arms. Having thus effectively disposed of his enemies, Perseus covered up his death-dealing trophy, and the wedding ceremonies were resumed. Later he departed with his bride to the country of Polydectes, where that king had been keeping his mother a prisoner until she would consent to marry him. He had long ago believed that Perseus had died, and was therefore much astonished to see him appear unharmed and victorious. Hearing of the cruel treatment his mother had received from Polydectes, the young hero determined a swift revenge. In the presence of the king and his court, he suddenly displayed the head of Medusa, and the whole company, just as they stood, were turned to stone. Then Perseus set sail with his wife and mother for his own country, but before he left, he returned to Pluto, the magic helmet, to Mercury, the winged sandals, and to Minerva, the wonderful Aegis. The august goddess of wisdom seemed to have taken a strange fancy to the Gorgon's head, so Perseus gave her this trophy of his victory, and she fixed it in the middle of her shield. When Perseus, with Andromeda and Danae, arrived in Argo, they found that old Acrisius had been driven from his throne, and that a usurper was enjoying his kingdom. It did not take long for the hero who had slain Medusa to kill the unlawful claimant and reinstate his grandfather. The old man had been languishing for years in prison, and was hardly able to endure the great joy of his release at the hands of one who he had long since believed to be dead. Things seemed to be settled, very happily, in spite of the oracle. But the decrees of the gods are sure to be fulfilled, and one day, when Perseus was playing quoits, he accidentally threw one wide of the mark. It struck Acrisius, who was looking on at the game, and killed him instantly. This unfortunate mishap so preyed upon the mind of Perseus that he could not remain in Argo, but exchanged his kingdom for that of Mycenae, over which he ruled many years, very wisely and very well. When at last Perseus died, the gods placed him among the stars with his wife Andromeda and with Cassiopeia, who had long since been cured of her vanity. Bellerophon. At the court of Proetus, king of Argos, there dwelt as a guest of honor a young prince named Bellerophon. He was a kinsman of Proetus, and a grandson of Sisyphus, the king of Corinth, so much honor was shown him. As he was strong, brave, and fearless, he was the leader in all the games, and his beauty won such favor at the court of the Proetus' wife, Queen Antea, that she sought his love. Since the youth could not in loyalty return her affection, he found it difficult to remain in Argos, for the queen was not content to receive only the courtesy due her, but importuned Bellerophon for his love. He tried many times to find some pretext for leaving his kinsman. So, when Proetus proposed that he should make a journey to Lycia to deliver some important message to its ruler, the youth was eager to go. Meanwhile, the queen, angered at his indifference, had told her husband that Bellerophon delighted in treating her with contempt in return for all her kindness, and that she could not endure his presence in Argos any longer. She demanded further that Proetus should put the young man at once to death, but that he should not let Bellerophon suspect that she had been the instigator of the deed. The king had readily believed his wife artfully contrived story, and declared that the insolent youth should be made to pay dearly for his ingratitude. As Bellerophon was already a hero at the court, Proetus dared not condemn him openly to death. So when the prince departed on his journey to Lycia, he carried with him some letters, whose purport he was far from suspecting. But the sealed message that he bore so light-heartedly was a request to King Iobates to put the bearer at once to death. King Iobates was the father-in-law of Proetus, and the ruler of Lycia had often relied on his powerful relative as an ally in time of war. So the king of Argos was confident that his instructions would certainly be carried out. The expedition of Lycia might, therefore, have had a different ending had not Bellerophon forgotten to deliver his letter for several days. Meanwhile, King Iobates, supposing him to be on a family visit, received him very hospitably, and made him a member of the royal household. After much feasting and entertainment, the young prince suddenly remembered the sealed message entrusted to his care, and hastened to deliver it to Iobates, with many apologies for his forgetfulness. But when the king read the letter, he was surprised and horrified in its contents, for he could not in cold blood kill the guest who had sat at his table, and yet he did not wish to refuse any demand made by Proetus. When the courtiers saw his white face and troubled looks, they wondered what the message contained, but no one suspected its real import. At last, a solution of the difficulty came to the king's mind, and he began to praise Bellerophon for the bravery and courage that he had made the young prince famous throughout Greece. He lamented that no such fearlessness dwelt among the men of Lycia, for otherwise the Chimera would not be living in security and laying waste to the king's lands. When Bellerophon heard what terror was inspired by the mere mention of the Chimera's name, he wondered whether he would be afraid to face this fateful creature with its lion's head, goat's body, and dragon tail. When he expressed surprise that no hero had slain it, Iobates at once implored him to help the stricken country and go himself to fight the Chimera. Bellerophon might have been eager for this adventure, had he not learned to love the king's daughter, Philonoe, who had found the handsome stranger more to her liking than all the youths of Lycia. He was therefore loath to leave the princess and depart on so perilous a venture, but at the repeated urging of Iobates, he began to make preparations for the journey. Before setting out, he first consulted the soothsayer, Polyidus, who advised him to procure the winged horse Pegasus if he hoped to succeed in slaying the Chimera. This advice was probably well meant, but it was very discouraging, for how could Bellerophon expect to bridle the famous immortal steed that had never known the touch of any man's hand? He knew too well that Pegasus was rarely seen by mortal eyes, for he dwelt on the calm heights of Mount Helicon, a sacred spot of the Muses, and seldom came to earth, except to visit the fountain of Pyrene near Corinth, whose clear waters sometimes tempted him to leave his lofty home. Very few people had ever seen this snow-white horse, with his wonderful silvery wings that carried him through the air as buoyantly as an eagle in flight. Whenever Pegasus deigned to come to earth to taste the sweet waters of Pyrene, he sped over the grassy meadows so swiftly that even the fleetest runner could not hope to catch him. He had never been bridled in all his wild and free life, and for beauty and strength and the sheer joy of living there was nothing like him in the whole wide world. Sleeping at night as he did on a lofty mountain top, and passing the greater part of the day in the air, Pegasus seemed hardly to be a creature of the earth. Whenever he was seen, up very high above people's heads, with the sunshine on his silvery wings, one would have thought that he belonged to the sky, and that, skimming a little too low, he had got astray among our mists and vapours, and was seeking his way back again. In the summer-time, and in the beautifulest of weather, Pegasus often alighted on the solid earth, and, closing his silvery wings, would gallop over hill and dale for pastime as freely as the wind. When Bellerophon was advised to catch this glorious winged steed, it was no wonder that he felt discouraged, for nowhere could he find an old man, maiden, or child who ever had so much of a glimpse of the snow-white Pegasus. Someone told him, however, that the immortal steed had once been tamed by Minerva, and owed obedience to her. So he went immediately to the temple of the warrior goddess, and begged her to help him. For many hours he prayed before Minerva's shrine, but there came no answer to his petition, and at last, worn with fatigue and discouragement, he fell asleep on the steps of the temple. When the first rays from Apollo's golden sun-car fell on the white marble pillars of the temple, Bellerophon awoke, and to his great astonishment, he found in his hand a golden bridle. Believing this to be the answer to his prayers, he set out hopefully on his search for the winged horse, and before journeying very far, he came to the fountain of Pyrene, where a beautiful, clear stream bubbled up beside a grassy meadow so redolent of ripening clover that it might tempt a far more fastidious horse than the immortal Pegasus. Bellerophon spent many days beside the fountain, but he never caught a glimpse of the white-winged steed, nor saw any mark of his hoofs upon the sod. Once, an old man stopped to ask him why he was lingering so long beside the fountain, and then shook his white head incredulously when Bellerophon spoke of Pegasus and his silvery wings. At last the young hero grew so discouraged that he decided to return to the court of Iobates. But on the very morning he intended to leave Pyrene, he chanced to wake just at dawn, and leaning over the fountain to bathe his flushed face, he saw reflected in the water an image that made his heart beat fast with hope and joy. It seemed like a great white bird, flying high up among the clouds, where the sunlight shone on its silvery wings. Nearer and nearer it came, sweeping the air in great wide circles, and at last it alighted beside the fountain. Bellerophon, meantime, had hidden himself in the bushes, and now he watched this beautiful creature as it folded its gorgeous wings and bent its arching neck to drink the clear water. Then Pegasus daintily cropped a few clover blossoms, shook his long white mane, and began to run up and down the meadows, capering madly like a colt just set free in the pasture. After rolling luxuriously in the thick grass, and racing like the wind across the meadow, Pegasus grew tired of his play, and folding his snow-white wings, trotted quietly up to the fountain to take one more drink before flying back to his home on Mount Helizon. It was then that Bellerophon crept noiselessly out of his hiding place, and while the unsuspicious Pegasus was drinking the cool water and his eyes were no longer watchful, the youth boldly sprang upon his back and took firm hold of the thick mane, being careful meantime not to let Minerva's golden bridle slip from his fingers. Bellerophon had ridden many a horse, but never one as wild and spirited as this, for the glorious Pegasus had not known until now the ignominy of bearing a mortal rider on his back, and he did not intend to submit to the disgrace. When he felt the touch of Bellerophon's knees on his broad flanks, he made a tremendous bound into the air, and before the youthful rider could realize what had happened, he found himself hundreds of feet above the earth. The winged horse snorted and shook with anger, and tried to unseat his rider by every trick known to equine ingenuity. He bounded forward with a sudden jerk, reared, turned over in the air, until half the time Bellerophon was riding with his head downward, but in spite of his efforts he could not throw off the strange thing that had clung to his back. All at once, Bellerophon saw his chance to slip the golden bridle between the maddened horse's teeth, and suddenly Pegasus became as gentle and tractable as if he had always obeyed the will of a master. Happy to find the conflict over, the young hero turned the head of his white-winged steed toward the mountain region where the dread Chimera dwelt. It was a wild and rocky part of the country that Bellerophon looked down upon, and he saw all around him the evidence of ruin brought by a fire-breathing monster. The dwellings of peasants were in smoking ashes. Carcasses of half-eaten cattle were strewn about the barren pastures, and human bodies were also to be seen, torn and mangled by ruthless claws. On the mountainside was a deep hole in the rocks, and from it issued clouds of black smoke that had a horrid, stifling smell as it rose up from the cavern's mouth. As Bellerophon descended nearer to the earth, the delicate nostrils of his horse at first contract with the foul smoke, and he found it hard to persuade Pegasus to fly closer to the Chimera's den. When they did approach through the thick clouds of smoke, Bellerophon saw the monster's great body stretched out at full length in the cave, while all three heads lay on half-eaten carcasses that were strewn across the floor. The lion and the goat, part of the Chimera, were asleep, but the snake was wide awake, and when it saw Bellerophon approaching on its winged horse, it raised its head and began to hiss so loudly that it roused the other creatures until they too were intent and watchful. And then the smoke poured out of the cave, more thickly than before, and if Pegasus had not carried him quickly away from the poisonous fumes, Bellerophon would have been suffered long before he was able to get near enough to deal the Chimera a mortal blow. But the brave horse bore him out of danger, and kept him far above the thick smoke until the monster crawled out of its lair. Then, like the swift rush of air, Bellerophon swooped down upon the Chimera and cut off its three horrible heads with his sword. But even then, the danger was not over, for the headless creature sprang into the air and clutched wildly for its enemy with its long claws. So sure an instinct for destruction did the Chimera have, that, mangled and dying as it was, it struck directly at Bellerophon and would have torn him to pieces, had not the faithful Pegasus borne him swiftly out of reach of the deadly claws. After a few vain attempts to grasp its destroyer, the chimera's body gave a great convulsive shudder and fell back, stone dead, upon the blood-soaked ground. Then Bellerophon sped back to the court of Iobates and announced that the chimera was dead. The king was so glad to hear the monster could no longer devastate his land, but he was sorry to see Bellerophon returning unhurt and victorious, and with such a wonderful prize as the winged horse Pegasus. Most people had never believed that this immortal steed really existed, and thought it was the stories about, as it were, merely old wives' tales. Iobates did not dare to kill so popular a hero as the young prince became after his adventure, but he did send him off on other perilous journeys, hoping that on one of them he might meet his death. However, Bellerophon never came to any harm, for he had always the sure help of Pegasus, and he returned safe from each expedition with trophies to lay at the feet of his beloved princess, Philonoe. At length, the king was convinced that Bellerophon was under the special protection of the gods, and hoping to win their favor, he gave the young hero his daughter in marriage, and appointed him as successor to the throne. For several years, Bellerophon lived happily in Lycia, but his many victories with Pegasus had made him presumptuous, and he felt that his true place was with the immortals. So, one day, he mounted his winged steed and flew far above the earth into the white clouds that wrapped the top of Mount Olympus. Angered at this insolence and daring, Jupiter sent an enormous gadfly which stung Pegasus so cruelly that he gave a sudden leap forward, and this unexpected movement threw his too confident rider from his back. The luckless Bellerophon felt the reins slip through his fingers, and he plunged downward through mist and clouds many, many miles to the earth. This terrible fall would have killed anyone but a mythological hero, but Bellerophon, though bruised and shaken, only lost his eyesight. Ever afterwards he wandered through the fair places of the earth, lame, blind, and lonely, lamenting the foolish pride that had led him to risk the anger of the gods. What was his end? No one ever knew, but he probably died in some distant land, alone and forgotten, while Pegasus went back to the sunny slopes of Mount Helicon and never visited the earth again, even to drink those sweet waters of Pyrene. The story of Jason. In Thessaly, there once ruled a wise and good king named Aeson, who dwelt happily with his wife Alcimede and his little son, Jason. The king's reign did not last long, however, for his wicked brother Peleus collected a band of armed warriors and made war upon Aeson, who, after a feeble resistance, surrendered his throne to the invader and escaped secretly from the kingdom with his wife and child. The dethroned monarch took refuge in a distant country and lived in concealment until Jason was old enough to be sent to some place of greater safety, for they knew that the cruel Peleus would try to seek him out and kill him. And so they entrusted the boy to the care of the centaur Chiron. After telling that wise teacher who the lad really was, and begging him to bring Jason up, with the desire some day to avenge their wrongs. Chiron instructed the youth in all the arts of which he himself was a master, and when the young prince reached manhood, he was one of the bravest and most skillful of the centaur's pupils. Jason had been told many times of his uncle's tyranny, and he burned to avenge the wrongs of his parents. But his wise teacher cautioned him to wait until he had strength and power enough to face the wicked usurper. When he deemed the youth sufficiently trained to leave his care, Chiron sent Jason forth, bidding him satisfy now his desire for revenge. He advised his student, however, to be careful and do not do any harm to anyone except the man who had wronged him. Jason promised to obey his tutor's instructions, and, girding on his sword, set out on the journey to his native city. It was springtime when Jason turned his steps towards his father's kingdom, and the rains had swollen all the streams, making them difficult to ford. One day as he stood on the bank of a river, wondering where he had best attempt to swim across, he saw an old woman looking despairingly at the rushing, foaming water. Jason spoke gently to her and offered to carry her across the river. This unexpected assistance was gratefully accepted, and Jason bravely waded into the shallowest part of the stream. The swift current and his unwieldy burden made the crossing very difficult, so that when Jason had at last reached the opposite bank, he was very glad to rest. He did not mind the wetting, but he was sorry to find that he had lost one of his sandals in the river. As it was useless to try to find it, he set off with only one of the remaining. But first he stopped to say goodbye to the old woman. But to his surprise, he no longer saw a bent and trembling figure beside him, but he stood in the presence of a beautiful, imperious woman, whose royal bearing would have proclaimed her a goddess, even if the startled youth had been beside her the peacock that ever attends the stately Juno. Jason trembled at this transformation of his aged passenger, but Juno smiled graciously upon him and bade him have no fear, for she had come to promise him her aid and protection. Before he could render suitable thanks, the goddess had all but disappeared, and Jason continued his journey, full of courage and confident of success. Soon he came to his native city, where he found a great crowd of people assembled at the temple, for Perseus, the king, was offering on that day special sacrifices, and a public festival had been proclaimed throughout the city. Jason joined in the crowds that were hurrying the temple, and stood quite near his uncle, while the king, unconscious of his presence, was performing the sacrifices. When the ceremony was over, Perseus glanced around at his assembled company, and started back pale with terror when he saw Jason, for although he did not recognize his nephew, he had been warned by an oracle to beware of a youth who would appear before him wearing only one sandal. Trembling, but striving to hide his fear, Perseus spoke to the stranger and asked for his name. And then Jason confronted his uncle boldly, declared his own parentage, and demanded that the usurper should at once resign the throne and restore old Aeson to his rightful place in the kingdom. Peleus did not openly defy the fearless youth, but neither did he intend to give up his power and wealth. And so, being a crafty man, he sought to beguile Jason with soft words, and promise to send at once for the absent king and queen. He urged his nephew to remain at court, and invited him to the royal household that evening with a splendid banquet. Jason needed no persuasion to eat, drink, and be merry, and as the wily Peleus plied him with rich viands and the choicest wine, his heart warmed towards his uncle, and he felt less eager to carry out his long-cherished vengeance. During the feast, the bards sang of brave deeds done by heroes, and one old musician told of the famous golden fleece that many had sought to take by stealth. But of those who went on the quest, no one ever came back to tell why they had failed. Jason listened eagerly, while the old singer told how the famous fleece once belonged to a ram that the friendly Neptune sent to Phrixus and Helle to enable them to escape from the persecution of their stepmother Ino. This was the same Ino who cared so tenderly for the infant Bacchus. But to her stepchildren she was very cruel. Their own mother, Nephele, had been sent away by King Athamas because he had wearied of her and wished to marry Ino. And when the banished mother learned how neglected and ill-treated her children were, she begged Neptune to help them. So the sea god sent a golden-fleeced ram, which Phrixus and Helle mounted and thus escaped from their cruel stepmother. Only Phrixus reached the land of Colchis, however, for when the ram flew over the sea, Helle grew frightened at the sight of the waves tossing so far beneath her, and suddenly lost her hold on the golden fleece. Her brother reached out to clutch her, as she had slid from the ram's back, but it was too late, and the unfortunate maiden fell into that part of the sea that is since known as the Hellespont. Phrixus reached Colchis safely, and here he sacrificed the ram to Neptune and hung its golden fleece on a tree, under which he placed a dragon to guard it night and day. As Jason listened to this story, he felt as though he was here for a task worth his mettle, and it needed no urging from Peleus to make him declare himself ready to set forth on the adventure without further delay. The wily king praised Jason's courage, and prophesied that he would be called the greatest among the heroes, while in his heart he felt assured that the troublesome nephew would never return alive. He promised to render Jason every assistance in his power, and offered to fit him out with a well-manned ship. But the young adventurer had been thinking over it more calmly, and had begun to distrust his uncle's apparent kindness. And so he went for counsel to the shrine of Jupiter at Dodona, where there was an oracle called the Speaking Oak. And, on consulting this, he learned that, to his great satisfaction, that Juno was still watching over his welfare, and would aid him in the quest of the golden fleece. The Speaking Oak then bade him cut off one of its great limbs and carve from it a figurehead for his ship. It told him also that the ship in which he was to sail should not be made of timber cut from any ordinary trees, but should be built of the wood taken from pine trees that grow on Mount Pelion. When Jason had carved his figurehead, he found that it had the gift of speech and could counsel him wisely in all his affairs. So, as soon as the ship was ready, the figurehead was fastened to its prow, and Jason set out on his memorable voyage. He called the ship the Argo, and himself and his fellow adventurers the Argonauts. Among his companions there were many men famous for their brave deeds: Hercules, Admetus, Castor and Pollux, Meleager, Orpheus and Theseus. All these were eager for new adventures, and no one doubted that with so many heroes to aid him, Jason would succeed in winning the Golden Fleece. Even Peleus, as he watched the voyagers sail away, wished that he had sent the daring youth on an even more perilous journey. The voyage to Colchis was full of strange happenings, both on land and sea. The first disaster that overtook the Argonauts occurred when Hercules went ashore to get some fresh water with a youth of the party named Hylas. There had been several occasions on which it was necessary for some of the heroes to land in order to get food or water, but the delay had been brief, and the voyage quickly resumed. But this time they were in need of new oars, so Hercules offered to procure them, and took with him his favorite companion Hylas. While he himself was felling trees, he sent Hylas in search of fresh water, and the youth, after wandering around for some time, came at last to a fountain whose waters were so pure and so cool that he lingered long beside it. The nymphs who lived in the fountain were charmed with the beauty of Hylas and determined to keep him with them. So when he bent over the water, they drew him gently down into its clear depths. Hercules, after waiting long for the lad's return, went in search for him, but no trace of him could be found anywhere in the lonely forest. Though he called again and again, no voice answered, for Hylas lay in the green bed of the fountain, and his ears were deaf to the cries of his friend. Hercules' grief was so great over the loss of Hylas that he refused to accompany the expedition any further, and he made his way home alone on foot. On another occasion, Jason landed in Thrace, and here he learned of the blind king Phineus, who was tormented by some harpies, creatures half women and half bird, that ate or befouled all the food placed before the wretched king. The only meals Phineus could take away were by stealth, and the poor king's life was rendered miserable by the constant presence of these foul, foul monsters. When the two sons of Boreas, who were happily gifted with wings, heard Jason relate the story of the harpies to his companions, they promptly offered help, and, flying at the loathsome birds with drawn swords, the brothers drove them out of Thrace into an island so far away that they never came back to bother the king again. The Story of Jason, Part 2. Once, in the course of the voyage, Jason was attacked by a flock of brazen feathered birds that showered their sharp metal plumage down on the Argonauts and wounded some of them sorely. Jason soon found that weapons were of no use against these formidable enemies, so he consulted the figurehead that had always counseled him wisely. In obedience to its advice, the heroes clashed their swords and spears furiously against their shields until the birds, terrified by the noise, flew away and never returned. When the Argo approached the Symplegades, or clashing islands, Jason remembered the words of Phineus, who had advised him to let a free dove whose speed was less than that of his swift vessel before he attempted a passage. If it flew easily between the rocks, then the ship could easily follow it, with no chance of being ground to pieces as the islands clashed together. When the Argonauts reached the dangerous spot, Jason set free a dove out before him. He watched its flights anxiously, and when it glided between the rocks, with only a tail feather caught, he guided the ship so close behind it that as he slid through the opening made by the rebound of the island, the deadly rocks merely grazed the rudder. Since their destructive power depended on allowing no vessels to pass them unharmed, the evil force of the islands possessed was now broken, and they were henceforth chained fast to the bottom of the sea. At last, the Argo reached the shores of Colchis, and Jason made known to King Aeetes his desire to possess the golden fleece. The owner of that wonderful pelt was very naturally not ready to give it even to the boldest of strangers, but he treated the Argonauts kindly, and even promised to bestow upon Jason the coveted fleece if he could catch and harness to a plough 2 brazen-hoofed fire-breathing bulls. Then, having done this, he must plough up a certain piece of ground sacred to Mars, and sow the field with dragon's teeth, just as Cadmus had done. Last of all, he must conquer the armed giants that would spring up in the field after the sowing, and then slay the dragon that guarded the golden fleece. This was certainly enough to daunt any hero, but Jason, relying on the help of Juno, agreed to the king's terms, and went down to the seashore, where his ship lay, to consult the figurehead who had never yet failed him. On the way, he met Medea, the king's daughter, who was very much taken by the young stranger's beauty, and hoped to induce him to marry her. Medea herself was very beautiful, and being also as a sorceress, she was an invaluable ally in the adventure that had brought Jason and his friends from a far distant land. And so, before many days had passed, Medea plighted her troth to the young king who needed help so sorely, and the king's daughter promised to give him the aid of her magic art. On the day appointed for the great task, Jason boldly approached the fire-breathing bulls, for Medea had given him a charm by which the fierce brutes were rendered harmless, and were easily yoked and harnessed to the plough. Then, in the presence of the astonished spectators, who expected to see him crushed beneath the brazen hoofs, Jason ploughed the field, and having sown it with dragon's teeth, stood ready sword in hand to meet the attack of the giants who sprung up out of the ground, clad in full armor. When he saw the glittering spears turn toward him, Jason's heart began to quail, lest, after all, Medea's help should prove ineffective. And even the sorceress herself felt a momentary doubt of her own power to save her lover from his foes. As the armed men were about to rush upon him, Jason threw a stone in their midst, according to Medea's instruction, and the giants turned against each other and began a furious battle that ended in the destruction of the entire host. And then the hero, accompanied by Medea, hastened to the tree where the golden fleece hung, and here a charm was needed to lull to sleep the dragon who guarded the treasure. And soon as the great eyes that had never been known to close began to shut one by one, Jason stepped softly up behind the monster and cut off its head. but it was a moment's work to tear the fleece from the tree where it had hung for so many years, and to bear it in triumph to the Argo, where Jason's friends stood anxiously waiting his coming. The men were already at the oars, for he had told them to be ready to sail at a moment's notice, when he should begin to appear with the golden fleece. In spite of Aeetes' promise, the hero did not trust him, and so made his preparations for departure very secretly. When he and Medea boarded the Argo with their prize, the rowers bent with all their strength to the oars, and the ship slid silently and swiftly out from the harbor. Aeetes soon learned that the Grecian vessel had left the shores, carrying on board the golden fleece, his daughter, and worst of all, his only son and heir, Absyrtus. So he hurriedly manned his royal barge with rowers and set out after the Argonauts. Although the fugitive vessel made good speed, the king's ship began to gain on it, and as Jason watched the distance between the vessels growing less and less, he was filled with despair and begged the sorceress to aid them with her magic. Medea did not care what fate befell the Argonauts, but she had no desire to leave Jason and return to her father's court. So she did not hesitate to resort to any means of preventing the king from overtaking them. She therefore killed her brother, Absyrtus, and, cutting his body into pieces, dropped them one by one over the side of the vessel. Aeetes, seeing the remains of his only son floating in the water, stopped to collect them, so that the body might have some suitable burial, and by this delay the Argonauts were allowed to escape. The wretched king then returned to Colchis, where he buried Absyrtus, with prayers to the gods to bring vengeance upon this inhuman daughter. When the Argo and its triumphant crew reached Thessaly, they found that their arrival caused great surprise, as well as joy, for King Pelias had never supposed that they would actually return, and felt himself secure against any further trouble from the youth with only one sandal. He was therefore much dismayed at seeing Jason, especially as he came unharmed and bearing so rich a trophy as the golden fleece. The usurper knew that his days of power were over, and when Jason again demanded the kingdom in his father's name, Pelias was forced to resign his throne to the lawful king. Old Aeson was then summoned from his palace of banishment and restored to his rightful place, but he was so weak and decrepit that power had no charm for him, and he accepted his throne very reluctantly. And so Jason begged his wife to use her magic in behalf of the old king, and Medea, anxious to please her lover, willingly promised to restore Aeson to all the vigor of manhood. To prepare the magic potion that was bring youth and health, the sorceress went out into the meadows on 9 successive nights, beginning with the new moon, and gathered herbs whose magic properties that she alone could tell. Then she set a cauldron in the deepest part of the woods, and built under a slow fire that burned always night and day. In the cauldron she threw many magic herbs, flowers with acrid juice, stones from the far east, and sand from all the surrounding ocean, hoarfrost gathered by moonlight, a screech owl's head and wings, and the entrails of a wolf. Then she added some bits of tortoise shell and the liver of a stag, for these animals are tenacious of life, and the head and beak of a crow that outlives 9 generations of men. All these she boiled together, stirring them with an olive branch, and when she lifted out the branch, It was full of new leaves and heavy with young olives. These preparations being finished, and the time being full moon, Medea went forth alone into the forest with old Aeson, just at midnight, when all creatures slept, and no breath of wind stirred the trees. She laid the old man on a bed of herbs, and after putting him into a deep sleep, cut his throat and let out the sluggish blood of age. Then she poured into the wound the juices from her cauldron, and when these began to flow through the king's weak frame, he underwent a wonderful change, for his hair and beard lost their whiteness and took on the glossy hue of youth. His paleness changed to the ruddiness of manhood, and his feeble limbs felt all the vigor of a hero in his prime. When the daughters of Peleus saw this miracle of old Aeson transformed into a stalwart man, they begged Medea to use her magic in restoring their father to his former youthfulness. And the sorceress promised to help Peleus, just as she had the father of Jason. And so she prepared a cauldron full of boiling water, and pretended to put in the necessary ingredients for the magic potion. But when the devoted, though too credulous daughters of Peleus killed their father, and put his body into the cauldron, as Medea had directed, they did not restore him to youth, but merely ended, very effectively, the life that they so ardently wished to prolong. Though Medea's great beauty and her power as a sorceress kept Jason faithful to her for many years, he at last grew weary of her, and prepared to wed a maiden named Creusa. Pretending to approve of his choice, and concealing her rage at Jason's heartlessness, Medea sent the bride a beautiful, though poisoned robe. The unsuspicious Creusa was delighted with this rich gift, but as soon as it rested on her shoulders, the hapless maiden was seized with terrible convulsions, from which she shortly after died. Then Medea killed with her own hands the children she had borne to Jason, so that she might have no reminder of his falseness, and fled in her dragon car to Athens, where she sought the protection of King Aegus, the father of Theseus. It was here that she lived for many years, for the king, not knowing her history, and being enamored of her beauty, married her and made her his queen. Jason, filled with remorse and despair, now led a most unhappy life, and spent most of his time on the seashore beside the great hulk of the Argo, which was slowly rotting away on the beach. One day, a sudden gale detached a loose beam from the vessel, and it fell upon the head of Jason, killing him instantly. And thus ended forever the voyages of the Argonauts. The Caledonian Hunt. One of the heroes of the Argonautic expedition was Meleager, son of Oeneus and Althea, king and queen of Caledon. When Meleager was born, his mother saw in a vision the three fates spinning the thread of her child's life, and she heard them foretell that he would live until the brand then burning on the hearth should be consumed. Althea, terrified by the vision, awoke, and snatching the brand from the fire, she plunged it into an earthen jar full of water. When she saw that the last spark was extinguished, she carefully hid the brand on whose existence depended the life of her son. Meleager, thus saved from death, grew up into splendid and vigorous manhood, and was welcomed by Jason as a fitting companion for the famous voyage to Colchis. While his son was absent on this expedition, Oeneus offended Diana by omitting to offer to her the customary yearly sacrifice. So the angry goddess sent a fierce boar to devastate the country. This creature was of such enormous size and strength that no hunter dared to attack it, and it laid waste the fields of Caledon by trampling on the young corn, rooting up vines and olive trees, and devouring flocks and herds, thus creating wild confusion among the panic-stricken people. When Meleager returned from his voyage and learned of the disaster that had overtaken the land, he summoned a band of heroes and set out to slaughter the wild boar. Jason, Nestor, Telamon, the father of Ajax, Theseus, and his friend Pirithous, Peleus, afterwards the father of Achilles, the twin brothers Castor and Pollux on their snow-white horses, all these and many others came at Meleager's call to join in the hunt. When the youths came, also Atalanta, the daughter of Gesius, king of Arcadia. This princess had been left when an infant on the top of Mount Parthenium and exposed to the hunger of wild beasts, for her father was angry at finding that the gods had sent him a daughter instead of the longed-for son. Atalanta was not devoured, however, nor did she perish from cold, for a kindly she-bear nursed the deserted infant, and she grew up strong and fearless. Later on, some shepherds found the sturdy little maiden in the woods, and taking her to their rude home, they cared for her and taught her to follow the chase. Thus she had grown up like a boy, fearless, bold, skilled beyond most use in the use of bow and spear. When the company of heroes saw Atalanta ready to join them in the chase for the wild boar, they were disposed to scoff at the idea of a maiden taking part in an adventure whose dangers might make brave man fearful. But Meleager, won by Atalanta's beauty, welcomed her eagerly and begged her to share in the hunt. Then the company set forth into the forest, and they did not have to wait long for their quarry, for as soon as the wild boar heard the barking of the dogs and the snorting of the steeds, he rushed out of his lair and savagely attacked the hunters. One after another, the heroes were gored by the boar's long tusks, or thrown down and trampled on by the cruel hoofs. The others were put to flight. Jason threw his spear, but it only grazed the boar's side. Telamon rushed forward, but stumbled over a projecting root and fell to the ground. Nestor, thrown headlong by a furious attack from the boar, sought safety in the branches of a tree. Theseus hurled his lance, but it was caught by a bow and turned aside. Then an arrow from Atalanta's bow pierced the brute's side, and blood flowed from the wound. The infuriated boar turned savagely upon her, but Meleager, who was ever near the maiden, hurled his spear with so true an aim that the boar fell dead upon the bloody and trampled ground. Then the heroes crowded around Meleager, congratulating him on his victory. But he refused to accept the honor of having slain the boar, and gave to Atalanta its head and rough hide as trophies belonging to the victor. His companions were angered that such honor should be given to a mere girl, and they feared the scorn and ridicule that would be heaped upon them when they returned to report the success of the hunt. Meleager, however, did not heed their murmured threats, nor did he listen to the reproaches of his two uncles. Plexippus and Doxeus, who had accompanied him. To see themselves thus rivaled by a boyish girl was too humiliating for the pride of these two princes, and they began to insult Atalanta by chiding her for joining in the sports of men and showing such unfeminine boldness. Then they attempted to snatch from her the trophies of the hunt, and at this Meleager, who had been incensed at the taunts of Atalanta, turned upon them and in a blaze of fury killed them both with his sword. Meanwhile, Althea had heard that the boar was slain, and was on her way to the temple with a thank offering, when news was brought to her that her two brothers had been killed, and by the hand of her son. Then the sister's desire for vengeance crowded out of her heart the mother's love for her son, and she brought out of its place concealment of the brand on whose existence depended Meleager's life. She lit a fire, and then hesitated for a moment whether to commit this dreadful deed or not, but the thought of her murdered brothers had hardened her heart, and she threw the brand into the fire. As the flames wrapped around it, Althea fancied that she heard it give a groan, and seized with remorse, she was about to snatch it from the fire. But once more, the memories of her fallen brothers stayed her hand, and she sat by the fire watching the flames consume it. While this was going on, Meleager suddenly felt his body seized with deadly pangs, and, though not knowing the cause, he was certain that his death was at hand. Then, like a brave man and a warrior, he lamented that he must die in this mysterious way, and not meet his death fighting like the heroes of old. He called upon his mother and father, upon his sisters, and upon his beloved Atalanta, but no one could save him from his fate. When the last piece of the brand fell into the ashes, Meleager died, and his mother, now filled with horror and remorse at her deed, took her own life. Atalanta, having won fame and the spoils of a celebrated hunt, was now welcomed at her father's court and returned to live there. But though she spent much time at the palace, she could not be induced to give up the chase, and roamed the forest as before, glorying in her freedom. Her father could not persuade her to marry, although many notable suitors sought her hand, for an oracle had once warned her that marriage would be her ruin. To her father's continued insistence, she at last returned this answer, that she would wed the suitor who could beat her in a foot race, but the conditions of the race would be to that the runner, if defeated, should lose his life. Rather than accept these terms, many of the suitors withdrew, but some remained to run in the race, for the maiden's beauty was worth such a great venture. None of them, however, succeeded in beating the fleet-footed Atalanta, and each man paid the price of defeat with his life. In vain, the old king implored his daughter to alter the impossible conditions, but Atalanta was determined to never wed. At one of the races, a youth named Hippomenes was made the judge, and when he learned the terms of the contest, he turned to the competitors and asked them why they were so foolish as to risk their lives for the sake of a maiden's beauty. As he was speaking, Atalanta appeared, dressed for the race, and when he looked at her, Hippomenes said, "Pardon me, youths, I knew not the prize you were contending for." When the race was over, and the defeated runners put to death, Hippomenes, undaunted by this result, boldly asked that he might try his fate. Atalanta looked at him pitifully, for he was a youth of noble bearing, and she felt a strange reluctance to see him go so bitterly to his death. She would not admit to herself that she could fall in love so quickly with a stranger, and that she half hoped that in this race she would not come first to the goal. As Hippomenes prepared himself for the running, she thought, what unkind God wishes to bring disaster upon this youth, and commands him, at the risk of a life so dear, to seek this marriage. In my own opinion, I am not of such great value. It is not his beauty that moves me, though he is good to look upon, but I pity him because he's still a boy. He himself cannot affect my sympathies, but his youth moves me. Then she tried to persuade Hippomenes to give up the race, but the more he looked at Atalanta, the more determined he was to win her, and he demanded the right to compete alone with the fleet-footed maiden. Reluctantly, Atalanta prepared for the race, and as Hippomenes waited eagerly for the sound of the trumpet, he breathed an ardent prayer to Venus to help him win the peerless maiden. Venus, the patroness of lovers, heard his prayer, and, unseen by any watchers, slipped into his hand 3 golden apples gathered from a wonderful tree on her own island of Cyprus. When the signal was given for the start, each runner shot forward like an arrow from the bow. But Atalanta soon outdistanced her lover, and his fate seemed assured. But just as she passed him, he threw in front of her a golden apple, and the maiden, surprised at this unexpected interruption, stopped to pick it up. Hippomenes pressed eagerly forward, but Atalanta soon overtook him, and she sped by him. He tossed another golden apple in her path. Caught by its glitter, the maiden stopped again, and while she paused to recover the apple, Hippomenes shot ahead. This advantage was soon lost, however, for again Atalanta outrun him, and was speeding past him towards the finish line, and then the lover, with another prayer to Venus, threw the 3rd golden apple. But by this time the maiden had begun to fear that she might be beaten by the handsome stranger, and so hesitated to stop for the tempting golden fruit. Venus impelled her, however, to pause long enough to snatch the apple quickly from the ground, and in that moment's delay, Hippomenes passed her and reached the goal. Thus, for the first time, the race was won by somebody else other than Atalanta, and Hippomenes claimed the maiden as his rightful reward. Triumphantly, he claimed his prize, and for a long time he and Atalanta were so happy that the words of the oracle seemed unlikely to be fulfilled. But, unfortunately, the lovers forgot to honor Venus, and the goddess was so angered at their ingratitude that she caused them to give offense to Rhea by desecrating her sacred grove. To punish them for this impiety, Rhea changed them into a lion and lioness, and yoked them to her care, where they were ever afterward compelled to draw. Well, we reached the end of Greek Myths Part 5. I think it's Part 5. I hope it is. And I am going to thank my top tier patrons: Dark, Carey, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, and Maverick. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoy doing the old Greek stories. I think they're a good bit of fun. So, I will see you on the next one. We have a few more to go. Lots of love to you all, and good night.